America buried a city under Greenland to win a nuclear war, but what they left down there has nothing to do with winning anything. And yet, 50 meters below the surface of the ice, something impossible showed up in the data. This is the story of what America actually buried beneath Greenland and why, 60 years later, nobody can go back. In April 2024, a NASA scientist named Chad Green was sitting on a Gulfstream 3 flying 150 miles east of Pituffik Space Base in northern Greenland. He was not looking for a Cold War city. He was looking at ice. His team had bolted a new kind of radar onto the belly of the plane, and they wanted to see how well it could map the layers inside the Greenland ice sheet and the bedrock beneath it. That was the whole mission. Instead, something appeared in the data that should not have been there. A cryospheric scientist from NASA described in one line, "We were looking for the bed of the ice and out pops Camp Century. We didn't know what it was at first." The first thing to understand about Camp Century is that it was never supposed to be a mystery. It was advertised. Walter Cronkite went there. The US Army made a short promotional movie calling it a remote research community. The Saturday Evening Post ran a glowing feature on it in 1960. In the official American version of events, Camp Century was a bold little scientific outpost carved into the ice, a proof of concept for living in the Arctic, a testbed for a new portable nuclear reactor, a place to drill the first deep ice cores and read the climate of the last 100,000 years. All of that was true. None of it was the real reason. In May 1959, the US Army Corps of Engineers picked a site on the Greenland ice sheet, 150 miles east of Thule Air Base, at an elevation of around 6,600 feet. The conditions were brutal. Temperatures dropped to 70 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Winds hit 125 miles per hour. The snowfall was more than 4 feet a year. And yet, within roughly 2 years, the Army had built something remarkable under the surface. 21 main trenches, close to 2 miles of tunnels, prefabricated wooden buildings tucked inside steel arches that were then buried again by snow, dormitories, a kitchen and cafeteria, a hospital, a chapel, a theater, a communications center, a laundry, a barber shop, room for up to 200 soldiers. The main trench was more than 1,000 feet long. They called it the city under the ice. The phrase was not marketing, that is what it was. Getting there was an expedition in itself. The Army first had to build a 3-mile road just to feed supplies into the construction site. 6,000 tons of material had to be hauled up from Thule Air Base, and most of it moved by what the engineers called heavy swings, enormous bobsled convoys that crawled across the ice at a maximum speed of 2 miles per hour. A one-way trip from Thule took 70 hours. The most delicate piece of cargo was the reactor, a portable, medium-power nuclear generator called the PM-2A, built by Alco for the Army. The first mobile nuclear reactor of its kind ever constructed. The shipment alone weighed 400 tons. In the sub-freezing air of Greenland, metal became brittle and could crack under its own weight. So every crate was handled like it was made of glass. Major Jim Barnett, one of the men overseeing the installation, put it simply, "We took every precaution in the book, and some that weren't there, to make sure it would work the first time." It did work. The reactor was installed in 1960, and it ran for 33 months, powering the city beneath the ice, while the men in the barbershop got haircuts and the men in the chapel got Sundays. That is the version of Camp Century that made it into the newsreels. The other version, the one that did not, had a code name, Project Iceworm. To understand why the United States was digging tunnels in Greenland in the first place, you have to understand the geography of a nuclear war as it looked in 1959. The shortest line between the continental United States and the Soviet Union runs across the Arctic. If long-range bombers were going to fly, or if missiles were going to cross, they were going to go over the top of the planet. Greenland sat directly under that line. It was, in the cold arithmetic of the Cold War, real estate. In April 1951, the United States and Denmark signed the Defense of Greenland Agreement under NATO, which in plain English allowed the Americans to build military bases across the island. 3 air bases went up that same year: Narsarsuaq, Sonderstrom, and Thule. Radar stations followed, feeding into the ballistic missile early warning system and the distant early warning line, the infrastructure that was supposed to give America a few precious minutes of notice if a Soviet strike was on its way. Thule alone sits less than 1,000 miles from the North Pole. It is still the US Air Force's northernmost base. But an air base and a radar station are not a nuclear missile. And a few years into the Cold War, the Army started to wonder whether Greenland could be something much more aggressive than an early warning system. What if the ice itself, thick, vast, slow-moving, almost impossible to survey from orbit, could be turned into the world's largest missile silo? That question became Project Iceworm. The plan, as laid out in a 1960 US Army Engineer Studies Center report titled Strategic Value of the Greenland Ice Cap, was almost absurd in its ambition. The Army proposed carving an additional 52,000 square miles of tunnels into the Greenland ice, roughly 3 times the size of Denmark itself, with the option of expanding it to 100,000 square miles. Inside this buried network, 600 ballistic missiles would be stationed, spaced 4 miles apart, serviced by 60 launch control centers and 11,000 soldiers living full-time beneath the ice. The missile itself was to be a modified, shortened, 2-stage version of the Air Force's Minuteman. The Army wanted to call it the Iceman. It was designed for a range of about 3,300 miles, far enough to hit most targets inside the Soviet Union. The key idea was not just hiding the missiles, the key idea was moving them. Pentagon planners believed that by shuttling 600 Iceman missiles back and forth between roughly 2,100 firing positions, they could make it mathematically impossible for Soviet targeting officers to keep up. A missile base you cannot find is a missile base you cannot destroy. One historian later described it as a deadly game of atomic whack-a-mole spread out across the top of Greenland. The Army's 1960 report put it more soberly. The missile force, the report concluded, would be hidden and elusive, deployed into an extensive cut-and-cover tunnel network. Invulnerable to all but massive attacks, and even then most of the force could still be launched. Concealment and variability would prevent the enemy from targeting the critical elements of the force. That was the real reason Camp Century existed. It was the prototype, the demonstration unit. The 200-man city was a scale model for an 11,000-man nuclear weapons platform that was supposed to follow it. And the Danish government had no idea. This is the part of the story that has never been cleanly resolved. Greenland was Danish territory. The 1951 agreement allowed American bases. It said nothing about American nuclear missiles. And Denmark's own position, stated publicly in 1958 by Prime Minister H.C. Hansen, was that Denmark should refrain from any measure that could even be construed as provocation. So when the U.S. Ambassador Val Peterson approached Hansen to quietly raise the possibility of storing nuclear weapons in Greenland, Hansen gave one of the most carefully worded non-answers in Cold War diplomatic history. You did not submit any concrete plan as to such possible storing, nor did you ask questions as to the attitude of the Danish government to this item. I do not think that your remarks give rise to any comments from my side. The Americans read that as a green light. It was not a green light. It was a shrug engineered to not technically be a yes and not technically be a no, but it was enough. Iceworm moved ahead. And Camp Century, the scientific outpost, quietly became the Army's laboratory for whether 11,000 men could live under the Greenland ice and keep 600 nuclear missiles combat-ready. For a few years, it almost looked like it might work. The camp functioned. The PM2. A reactor ran. The soldiers lived. The ice cores came up from the drill, and scientists began reading the climate of the last 100,000 years out of them. Real science happening on top of a real secret. In 1962, the Army successfully installed an experimental subsurface railway inside the trenches, one of the core technical pieces needed to shuttle Iceman missiles between firing points. That was the moment the project went from thought experiment to formal proposal. The Army presented Iceworm to the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, and then the ice started to move. The Greenland ice sheet looks, from the surface, like stone. It is flat, it is white, it is astonishingly still. From a helicopter, it can pass for the flattest, most inert landscape on Earth. That appearance is a lie. Snow and ice are what scientists call viscoelastic. Under pressure, they flow. Slowly, yes, but continuously. The Greenland ice sheet spreads outward from its center, like syrup poured onto a plate, except on a timescale that takes years to notice and decades to matter. And when you cut a trench into it and drop a building inside, that trench does not sit still. Its walls lean in, its ceiling sags, its floor rises, its width narrows. It is a room, slowly, being crushed. At Camp Century, the trenches dug in 1959 had compressed vertically and horizontally within 4 years, to the point where many of them had already reached their design margins. The Army had planned for a 10-year operational lifespan. The ice did not wait 10 years. By the middle of 1962, the ceiling of the reactor room had dropped so much that it had to be jacked up by 5 feet just to keep the equipment from being slowly mashed. Ice core samples taken by geologists at the site, the same cores that made the camp famous as a scientific triumph, told a quieter, far more inconvenient story. The glacier was moving much faster than the engineers had assumed. At that rate, it was going to destroy the tunnels and the launch stations inside of about 2 years. That was the end of the fantasy. The Army raised other objections too. The Iceman missile would need major modifications to launch through the ice in extreme cold. Communication with buried missile stations would be difficult. Locating individual firing positions with precision would be difficult. But the central, fatal problem was not politics, and it was not engineering tolerances. It was that you cannot build a permanent nuclear weapons platform inside something that is still flowing. In 1963, Project Iceworm was officially cancelled. Around the same time, Washington chose a different route for NATO nuclear sharing. The Navy had been pushing a competing proposal called the Multilateral Force, essentially a fleet of NATO ships and submarines armed with Polaris missiles, and the MLF won the internal debate, even though it was eventually rejected by the French government and never came to fruition either. Part of the reason the Army had wanted Iceworm so badly in the first place was simply that the Navy had the MLF, and no branch wanted to be left behind in the competition for funding. Iceworm lost that fight. The Iceman missile was never built. No nuclear weapons were ever deployed to Greenland. Camp Century itself limped on. The reactor was shut down during a planned maintenance period in July 1963 and never restarted. The camp ran on a diesel generator after that. It switched to summer-only operations in 1964. The portable reactor was removed that same summer. Year-round habitation became impossible. In 1966, the Army abandoned it. The last recorded visit by the Corps of Engineers was in 1969. Everything else, they left. Now let's come back to April 2024 and the Gulfstream 3 flying east of Pituffik. What Chad Green and Alex Gardner's team saw in the radar data that afternoon was not a whole city. It was a signature. The instrument they were flying, the Uninhabited Aerial Vehicle Synthetic Aperture Radar, or UAV-SAR, looks down and slightly sideways, and it builds a 3-dimensional picture of whatever is under the ice. Previous aerial surveys of Camp Century had used older ground-penetrating radar that stared straight down and produced a flat, 2-dimensional profile. In those older images, Camp Century showed up as a faint disturbance. a blip, a smudge in the ice layer. The UAV SAR image was different. It resolved individual buildings. The pattern that emerged in the data could be compared directly to the original 1960s layout plans of the camp. You could line them up, you could see which trench was which. The abandoned city, still down there in the dark, was suddenly legible again. NASA was careful to note that the image was not perfect. A band running across part of the capture makes it look, misleadingly, as though Camp Century is below the ice bed, when in fact it is still well inside the ice sheet. But the point of the flight was never to find Camp Century. The point was to test what UAV SAR could do. The point was to learn how to map ice sheets and their internal layers more precisely, the kind of work that feeds into projections of future sea level rise and shapes how scientists understand Antarctica, which is a much harder environment. Camp Century was a side effect, a Cold War relic that happened to sit under one of the test flights. And that is what makes the timing strange. The reason anyone cares about spotting Camp Century in 2024 is not historical curiosity. It is not nostalgia for a quirky Cold War story. It is that the ice above Camp Century, which was supposed to keep everything inside it sealed forever, has started to show signs of changing. When the Army walked away from Camp Century in 1967, they were working from an engineering assumption written plainly into the documents of the time. The phrase that keeps appearing in the old reports is that the base would be preserved for eternity by perpetual snowfall. The engineers believed that snow would keep falling year after year, and that whatever they left behind would be buried deeper and deeper with every winter. As William Colgan, the climate scientist who leads the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland's Camp Century Climate Monitoring Program, put it, the term global warming had not even been coined yet when they made that assumption. They were not wrong about the physics. They were wrong about the climate that was coming. The Army Corps of Engineers removed the reactor core when they left for destructive testing. They did not remove much else. What they left behind has been inventoried since, and the numbers are specific. Roughly 9,200 tons of physical infrastructure buildings, a railway, steel arches, the bones of the city itself. Around 200,000 liters of diesel fuel, most of which was stored in rigid tanks at tunnel depth and has almost certainly now ruptured. A non-trivial quantity of polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, a class of cancer-causing chemicals that were widely used at the time in paints and insulating fluids, and were particularly common in Arctic construction because they handled cold well. In some of the paints used on distant early warning bases from the same era, PCB concentrations reached over 5% by weight, and at least 24 million liters of grey water and sewage disposed directly into unlined sumps cut into the ice. The sewage situation was so bad during operations that core samples taken in 1962 found the liquid waste had already migrated 170 feet horizontally through the firn. And then there is the radiological waste. The reactor core was taken out, but the coolant from that reactor, low-level radioactive liquid, was disposed of in an unlined sump in the ice between 1960 and 1963. The bulk radioactivity of that waste at the time of disposal was, in absolute terms, non-trivial. In relative terms, it is worth knowing that the radioactive material from Camp Century is dwarfed by what was accidentally scattered near Thule Air Base in 1968 when a US B-52 bomber carrying 4 hydrogen bombs crashed onto the Greenland ice and spread radioactive contaminants across a wide area. Denmark and the United States cleaned that up quickly. Some studies have found pollution lingering there to this day. The Camp Century waste, altogether, covers an area of about 136 acres, roughly the size of 100 football fields. Most of the solid debris sits somewhere around 36 meters below the surface. The refrozen liquid waste is probably deeper, around 65 meters or more. And the question that scientists started asking in the mid-2010s was simple. Is any of that going to stay where it is? The honest answer is that nobody fully agrees. A 2016 study, led in part by the Colgans, used regional climate models to project what would happen at Camp Century under a business-as-usual emissions scenario. Their conclusion was that the ice sheet at that location could shift from net accumulation to net ablation, meaning more melting than snowfall, as early as around 2090. Once that transition happens, they argued, the eventual remobilization of the buried waste becomes inevitable, either through persistent surface melting over decades or through meltwater percolating downward through the firn much faster. Research has shown that surface meltwater can work its way 10 meters down into Greenland firn in a single summer. In some regions, liquid meltwater even persists year-round in an inglacial aquifer below 20 meters of depth. Under those conditions, PCBs could be moved laterally, carried down the slope of the ice, and eventually released into the sea along the coast hundreds of kilometers away, possibly decades before any waste ever became visible at the surface. That was the alarming version. A different climate model, a Norwegian one called NOR-ESM-1, produced a calmer picture. In that simulation, snowfall at Camp Century continues to outpace melting, and the camp gets buried deeper, not exposed. Then, in 2021, a further assessment looked more carefully at actual measurements from the Camp Century Climate Monitoring Program itself, using calibrated versions of the climate models. That study found something unexpected. Meltwater, in the observations at the station, has not been penetrating deeply at all. It has, in fact, never reached more than about 1.1 meters down. On the basis of that data, William Colgan stated the case bluntly. Since the annual snowfall at Camp Century continues to exceed the annual melting, the debris field is continuing to be buried more deeply. In his words, there is no risk that the debris will come to the surface due to melting before the year 2100. So, depending on which study you read and which model you trust, the waste under Camp Century is either a problem that starts in 70 years, a problem that starts in 150, or a problem that does not fully arrive until the 22nd century. What almost all the scientists agree on is that never is no longer on the list, and that is where it stops being a climate question and starts being a political one. We do not know who is supposed to clean this up. Greenland was a Danish colony in 1951 when the original defense agreement was signed. It is not a Danish colony anymore. In 1979, Greenland gained partial sovereignty, and in the decades since, it has continued to move toward greater self-governance. The treaty under which Camp Century was built says that American property in Greenland remains American property, and that it can be removed or disposed of by the United States after consultation with Danish authorities. What the treaty does not say at all is what happens when the property in question is 50 meters under the ice, is leaking cancer-causing chemicals, and is sitting beneath territory whose political status has changed twice since the original signatures were dry. Project Iceworm itself was kept secret from Denmark for decades. The broader world did not learn about the missile program until January 1995, when the Danish Foreign Policy Institute, known as DUPI, launched an inquiry into the history of nuclear weapons use and storage in Greenland. The inquiry was triggered by new information about the 1968 B-52 crash at Thule, which contradicted earlier statements by the Danish government. The declassified documents came out in 1996 and 1997. That is when Denmark and the world learned in detail what Camp Century had really been built to support. When the 2016 study went public, Greenland's Minister of Industry, Labour, Trade and Foreign Affairs at the time, Vitus Kujau-Kitsok, publicly demanded that Denmark prepare to clean up the base and compensate residents who live near it. He also called for a renegotiation of the Danish-American Defense Agreement. Members of the Danish parliament objected strongly, The United States government, in 2017, said it acknowledges the reality of climate change and the risk it poses, and would work with the Danish government and Greenlandic authorities to settle questions of mutual security around the site. What nobody has done is actually settle it. The researchers who discovered the scale of the waste have been careful about what they are asking for. Jeff Colgan of Brown University, one of the authors of the 2016 study, has said plainly that there is no environmental risk in the near term and that the pollution is likely to stay buried for decades. What he has asked for is not a multi-billion-dollar cleanup operation. What he has asked for is monitoring, better maps, better measurements, better data on exactly where each of the waste streams sits and how fast the ice above them is really changing. Since 2017, the Camp Century Climate Monitoring Program has been doing that work, measuring climate variables, ice and snow temperatures, and running ice-penetrating radar surveys over the debris field. Camp Century is not the only ghost the Americans left behind in Greenland either. There are around 30 other abandoned US military sites scattered across the island. At a former airfield called Bluey East 2, journalists who reached the site by helicopter and boat a 3-day trip found tens of thousands of rusting diesel barrels, crumbling asbestos-ridden buildings, corroding trucks, and what was estimated to be hundreds of cases of dynamite. Greenland's finance minister has written to the United Nations on the broader question of this legacy, arguing that the United States and Denmark should recognize responsibility for cleanup. Denmark has set aside the equivalent of several £1 million to begin initial work. Camp Century will be harder. Camp Century will be more expensive. Camp Century is under the ice. Here is what we still do not know. We do not know exactly how deep the deepest radiological waste has migrated, because ice-penetrating radar alone cannot delineate all of it. We do not know for certain whether the diesel tanks have ruptured or are still intact, though the assumption in the studies is that they have. We do not know, within a meaningful range, whether remobilization of the waste will begin in roughly 70 years, 150 years, or later than that. The climate models that should tell us disagree with each other, and the most recent on-site measurements suggest the earlier projections were too pessimistic. We do not know how partial Greenlandic sovereignty intersects with a 1951 treaty signed when Greenland was a colony, and we do not know which government, if any, will actually foot the bill when the day comes. And we do not know whether Camp Century is a special case or a preview, because the Arctic is full of abandoned Cold War infrastructure that was all built on the same assumption that the ice would hold everything forever. Somewhere under the Greenland ice, 36 meters down, a 1,000-foot trench called Main Street is still there. The prefabricated buildings inside it are crushed now, squeezed by decades of slow-moving ice. The barbershop is gone, the chapel is gone, the theater is gone. But the diesel tanks are still down there, and the sewage sumps are still down there, and the coolant from a reactor that ran for 33 months in the early 1960s is still down there. And a Gulfstream 3 flew overhead 2 years ago and saw enough of it to match the original blueprints. America built a city to win a war it never fought. Then it walked away and assumed the weather would keep its secret. The weather has other plans.